There is a material sitting in a laboratory in Zurich right now that absorbs its own weight in water from air, so dry that a human being would develop cracked skin and a nosebleed within an hour of breathing it. No pump, no power source, no moving parts of any description. Just a sheet of engineered material hanging in desert air, quietly pulling invisible moisture out of nothing that looks like it contains any moisture at all, and accumulating it into drinkable water through a cycle that resets itself every 24 hours, using nothing but the temperature difference between night and day. The research team that built it estimates that a panel the size of a door could supply enough drinking water for one adult indefinitely anywhere on Earth, in any climate, including the ones where every water harvesting technology that came before it stops working completely. They are not trying to sell it yet. They are trying to make it cheaper to produce, faster to scale, and more durable in the field conditions where it is most needed. But the underlying principle, the physics that makes a passive material pull water from air that contains almost none, has already been proven in field conditions that were chosen specifically because they represent the worst case: the driest air, the lowest humidity, the place where every other passive system fails, and it kept working. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the scale of the problem it is trying to solve, and the history of every solution that has been tried before it. More than 2 billion people on Earth right now do not have reliable access to clean drinking water. Not occasionally, not during drought years, regularly. As a feature of their daily lives rather than an interruption of them. Over 1 million people die every year from waterborne illness, directly linked to the absence of a clean water supply. A death toll that accumulates quietly without the visibility of a disaster event, because it is distributed across thousands of communities and happens one person at a time rather than all at once. By 2030, according to projections from multiple independent research institutions, global demand for fresh water will exceed the sustainable supply from all existing sources by 40%. Not 10%, not a gap that can be closed by fixing leaky pipes or reducing waste in wealthy countries. 40%. The gap between what the world will need and what the ground, the rivers, and the rainfall will reliably provide. And the regions where that gap will be most acute are, without exception, the same regions where the solutions that have historically been deployed, large dams, long aqueducts, deep groundwater pumping, energy-intensive desalination plants, are least accessible because they require capital investment and grid infrastructure that those regions do not have and have not historically received. The oldest responses to water scarcity were not infrastructure, they were observation. Communities that lived in dry places for long enough learned to read their environment carefully enough to find water in forms that were not obviously water. In the highlands of Peru and Chile, Inca communities stretched woven fabric screens across the paths of fog rolling inland from the Pacific, harvesting the moisture that condensed on the fibers and ran down into collection vessels below. The screens were simple, the fiber was locally available, and the water was real. In the Canary Islands, farmers on the volcanic island of Lanzarote developed a technique of arranging fields of dark volcanic gravel around individual vines planted in shallow craters. The gravel cooled rapidly at night, condensing dew on its surface, and the crater geometry directed that moisture downward toward the root zone of each plant. The system had no components that could fail, no energy input, no maintenance requirement. It was purely geometric, a shape that caused the environment to do useful work. In the highlands of Ethiopia and Cameroon, 40-foot structures woven from bamboo and engineered mesh called Warka water towers were designed to harvest rain, fog, and dew simultaneously, pulling water from multiple atmospheric sources through the same structure and accumulating yields of up to 26 gallons per day in favorable conditions, enough to supply a family and share with neighbors. But every one of these systems shares a constraint that limits where they can work and therefore limits who they can help. They all require the air around them to already contain significant moisture. Fog nets need fog. Dew collectors need enough humidity for dew to form on a cooled surface. Warka towers perform in proportion to how much atmospheric moisture is present in their location. And the communities with the most severe water stress, the ones in the Sahara, the Arabian Peninsula, the interior of the Atacama, the drylands of Central Asia, are precisely the communities where the air contains almost nothing for these systems to collect. The technology works beautifully where water is already moderately present in the atmosphere. It fails in the places where the need is most acute, which means it has spent decades solving the easier version of the problem, while the harder version went unsolved. The engineering response to that limitation over the past 20 years has been to add power. Atmospheric water generators, machines that refrigerate incoming air below its dew point to force condensation in the same way a cold glass of water pulls moisture from a humid room, can produce meaningful quantities of water from relatively dry air. In warm, humid conditions, they work well enough to supply a household. But they consume between half a kilowatt hour and a full kilowatt hour of electricity for every quart of water they produce. In the regions most affected by water scarcity, reliable grid electricity is exactly as unavailable as reliable clean water. The solution requires the resource it is supposed to substitute for. And in the places where both are absent, you are left with a device that is physically capable of producing water, but cannot run because there is nothing to power it. The gap between what the technology can do and what the people who need it can access has remained essentially unchanged for 2 decades, while the underlying water crisis has grown substantially worse. What MIT published in June of 2025 was a device designed specifically to operate inside that gap, not to work in the easier conditions where existing systems already function, to work in the hardest conditions, the driest air, the lowest humidity, the places where powered systems cannot run and passive systems cannot produce. The device is approximately the size of a standard window, roughly 5.5 square feet of total surface area, and from the outside, it looks like a glass enclosure with nothing remarkable about it. Inside, suspended at the center of that glass chamber, is a sheet of engineered hydrogel formed into a pattern of small raised domes resembling bubble wrap. That geometry is not decorative. It dramatically increases the total surface area of the material relative to its footprint, which directly increases the rate at which it can absorb water vapor from the surrounding air per unit of time. The hydrogel contains lithium chloride, a salt compound with one of the highest known affinities for atmospheric moisture of any material that can be practically manufactured. Lithium chloride will absorb water vapor from air at humidity levels as low as 10%. 10% relative humidity is air so dry that most living plants cannot survive in it. It is the humidity level of some of the most extreme desert environments on Earth, and the material inside this device pulls water out of it continuously. The problem with lithium chloride in previous hydrogel designs was contamination. The salt was effective at absorbing moisture, but it migrated into the collected water during the release phase, producing water with salt concentrations high enough to be undrinkable and potentially harmful. Every previous attempt to build a passive harvester around this class of salt-absorbing material ran into the same wall. The collection worked. The water was unsafe. The MIT team resolved this by incorporating glycerol into the hydrogel matrix. Glycerol acts as a stabilizing agent that binds the lithium chloride within the gel structure and prevents it from migrating into the water during the thermal release cycle. Field testing confirmed that water produced by the system contains salt concentrations well below the threshold established for safe drinking water. The contamination problem that had blocked this class of material from practical use for years was not a fundamental property of the approach. It was a formulation problem with a formulation solution. The underlying physics was sound all along. The operating cycle of the device runs on the temperature difference between night and day, a resource that is available everywhere on Earth and is actually more pronounced in desert environments than in moderate ones. At night, as the ambient temperature drops and relative humidity rises slightly even in dry climates, the hydrogel absorbs moisture from the surrounding air. The gel swells as it accumulates water vapor, holding it within its matrix. The glass enclosure around the gel is ventilated at night to allow fresh air to circulate across the gel surface and maximize absorption. As the sun rises and ambient temperature increases through the morning, the enclosure is sealed and the gel begins to warm. As it warms, it contracts and releases the stored moisture as vapor into the now sealed glass chamber. Here is where the second engineered element becomes critical. The outer surface of the glass chamber is coated with a radiative cooling polymer, a material that actively emits thermal radiation into the atmosphere and maintains its own surface temperature below that of the surrounding air, even in direct sunlight. Because the glass is cooler than the vapor being released inside the chamber, that vapor condenses on the inner surface of the glass as liquid water. The droplets run down channels formed into the lower edge of the glass enclosure and collect in a reservoir at the base of the device. The collected water is clean. The cycle resets every 24 hours. There are no filters to replace, no batteries to charge, no mechanical components to service, and no human input required beyond placing the device where it has access to ambient air and direct sunlight. The prototype was tested for 1 week in Death Valley, California. Death Valley was not chosen arbitrarily. It holds some of the lowest recorded ambient humidity levels in North America and regularly experiences the combination of extreme heat and extreme dryness that defines the worst-case operating condition for any water harvesting technology. Over the 7-day test period, the device operated across humidity levels ranging from 21% at the driest point to 88% at the most favorable point. It produced between nearly 2 and 5.5 fluid ounces of water per day, depending on conditions. On the driest days, at humidity levels where fog nets produced nothing, dew collectors produced nothing, and many powered atmospheric water generators operate below their rated efficiency, the MIT device continued producing water. It did not slow to trace amounts. It continued producing at a rate that, extrapolated across an array of panels, would represent a meaningful daily water supply. The research team calculated that 8 panels of the current prototype size would supply the daily drinking water requirement of 1 adult. A larger array of panels would supply the complete daily drinking water needs of a household, indefinitely, with no energy cost, no consumable inputs, and no connection to any external infrastructure. To appreciate the significance of that claim, it helps to understand what every previous approach to this problem required, and where each one broke down. Large-scale water infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, interbasin transfer systems, groundwater extraction networks requires capital investment measured in hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, political coordination across jurisdictions, years or decades of construction, and ongoing operational budgets that assume stable governance and institutional continuity. In regions with severe water stress, those preconditions are rarely met. The communities most in need of water infrastructure are precisely the communities least likely to have the institutional capacity to build and maintain it. Desalination, the process of removing salt from seawater or brackish groundwater to produce drinking water, works effectively at scale and has supplied coastal cities in the Middle East, Australia, and the American Southwest with reliable fresh water for decades. But it is among the most energy-intensive water production methods available. Large desalination plants consume enormous quantities of electricity and produce a concentrated brine discharge that creates its own environmental management challenges. It is a solution for wealthy coastal regions with reliable power infrastructure, not for inland communities with neither coastline nor grid access. Rainwater harvesting, the oldest method of all, works wherever rainfall is sufficient and sufficiently reliable. In regions where rainfall is seasonal, collection and storage infrastructure can bridge the dry months if the wet season delivers enough volume to fill reservoirs adequate to last until the next wet season. In regions where rainfall is genuinely scarce and unpredictable, there is simply not enough of it to harvest in quantities that make a meaningful difference. The method works where water is already falling. It cannot create water that the sky is not providing. Fog collection at modern scale has proven itself effectively in specific geographic niches. The Darcy Hammam project in Morocco operates the largest fog harvesting network currently functioning in the world, using more than 6,000 square feet of mesh netting to pull over 1,600 gallons of water per day from Atlantic fog that rolls regularly across the coastal mountain range where the system is installed. 5 remote Berber villages receive their water from the system with no mechanical input of any kind. In Chile's Atacama Desert, researchers have refined mesh coatings and geometric spacing to increase fog collection yields by up to 500%. Compared to earlier designs. These are genuine solutions that have improved real lives in the specific places where they work. But the Atacama, despite its reputation as one of the driest places on Earth, receives coastal fog from the Pacific that passive fog nets can harvest. The inland deserts, the Sahara's interior, the Rub al-Khali of the Arabian Peninsula, the Taklamakan in Central Asia, the dryland interior of sub-Saharan Africa, receive no fog. They receive almost no moisture of any kind from any direction. And it is in these places, where the atmospheric water content is lowest and the existing solutions most thoroughly fail, that the global water crisis is most severe and the need for a genuinely new approach is most acute. The hydrogel device does not solve this problem at the scale it needs to be solved. Not yet. The current prototype is a proof of concept, not a manufactured product. It is not commercially available. The production cost of the engineered hydrogel, the radiative cooling glass coating, and the precision-molded dome structure of the absorbing sheet is not yet at the level where deployment at the scale of millions of households in the developing world is economically feasible. The lead researcher on the project, now a professor at the National University of Singapore, has been explicit about what the next phase of development requires. The hydrogel formulation needs to be optimized for higher yield per unit area, meaning more water absorbed per square foot of material per cycle. The thermal release rate needs to be faster, meaning the morning warming phase should drive moisture out of the gel more completely and more quickly, maximizing the amount of condensate collected on the glass surface before the temperature differential between interior and exterior narrows toward midday. And the production pathway for the material needs to be simplified enough that it can be manufactured at cost points compatible with deployment in the communities that need it most, rather than only in research settings or wealthy market contexts. The team is also developing a multi-panel array configuration that links individual harvesters into a vertical grid structure, the way solar panels are stacked in an array to aggregate their individual outputs into a practically useful total. A single panel producing enough water to supply an adult's daily drinking requirement is a meaningful survival tool. An array of panels producing enough water to supply an entire household's drinking and cooking needs is a practical infrastructure replacement. An array large enough to supply a small community represents something that has not previously existed in the history of water technology. A decentralized, passive, zero-energy, zero-infrastructure water supply that can be deployed anywhere on Earth regardless of geography, rainfall, fog availability, grid access, or institutional capacity. That is not a modest claim. It is the specific claim that makes this technology worth watching even in its current unfinished state. because every incremental improvement in the material and the design brings it closer to a deployment threshold that, once crossed, changes the terms on which the global water crisis can be addressed. The broader shift this technology represents is a movement away from the assumption that water security requires infrastructure and energy, toward a model in which water can be produced locally, passively, and independently of any system that requires external inputs or institutional maintenance. That assumption, that water must be moved from where it exists to where it is needed through pipes, dams, pumps, and treatment plants, has defined water policy and water engineering for most of the last century. It produced extraordinary results in the regions where capital and governance were sufficient to implement it. It produced almost nothing in the regions where those conditions were absent. A technology that harvests water from air using only the daily temperature cycle of the sun, that requires no connection to any grid or any institution, that can be deployed by a single person without specialized skills or tools, that produces water in the driest conditions on Earth and improves in performance as the engineer who designed it refines the material further, represents a genuinely different model. Not a replacement for large infrastructure where large infrastructure can work, a solution for everywhere it cannot. For communities and individuals looking for something deployable right now without waiting for the MIT device to complete its development and reach commercial production, the established passive fog collection systems remain the most practical available option in compatible climates. A 3x3 foot fog net panel installed in a high humidity coastal environment with reliable fog patterns can collect between 3/4 of a gallon and 2.5 gallons of water per day, depending on conditions and mesh design. The systems require no power, no moving parts, and no maintenance beyond occasional cleaning of the mesh surface to prevent clogging with dust and particulate matter. Material costs for a DIY installation using commercially available shade cloth or purpose-designed fog collection mesh, PVC pipe framing, and collection gutters are under $100 per panel. Multiple panels scaled to the available fog resource, and the household water requirement can supply meaningful portions of a family's daily water needs in the right geographic context. The limitation remains the same one it has always been. The fog must be there. The MIT device is attempting to remove that requirement entirely. And if the next phase of development succeeds in bringing the material cost and production pathway to the threshold where wide deployment becomes feasible, the limitation that has defined passive water harvesting for its entire history will have been overcome, not by adding a power source, not by building larger infrastructure, but by engineering a material that treats the air itself as the water source. In any climate, under any sky, in any place on Earth, where the temperature drops at night and rises again in the morning, which is, without exception, everywhere.